Father Lancaster Marin, Max von Sydow, is an elderly Catholic priest on a dig in Iraq. Marin feels foreboding and encounters a number of strange omens, including the discovery of a series of perplexing items, a near miss with a runaway horse-drawn carriage, and a clock that stops ticking in the middle of a stroke. Finally, Marin comes across a statue of a strange demonic figure. Although it is not mentioned in the film, it is a representation of a demonic figure known as Pazuzu. Back in the United States, in Washington, D.C.'s upscale Georgetown neighborhood, a successful actress named Chris McNeil, Ellen Burstyn, begins experiencing strange phenomena. Chris lives with Reagan, Linda Blair, her 12-year-old daughter, Sharon, Kitty Wynn, and 2 housekeepers. Reagan's father is estranged from her for unknown reasons. Chris attributes the mysterious, unexplained sounds in the house's attic to rats. Reagan gradually begins to exhibit strange behavior, going through behavioral changes similar to depression and anxiety. She turns up in Chris's bed one night, complaining that her own bed was shaking. Chris is currently working on a new film in Georgetown with director Burke Dennings, Jack McGowan. One day, while filming a scene, she notices a young Catholic priest named Damien Karras watching her, Jason Miller. Father Karras has a psychology background and counsels parishioners at a nearby church. Chris also notices him one day while walking home from the shoot. Karras is a reflective, conflicted man. He talks to a superior about his vocation and asks to be transferred because he is losing faith. He also has an elderly mother who lives alone in a New York slum. When he visits her, he is reminded of how lonely her life is, and he feels guilty that she must live in such deplorable conditions. Strange occurrences in the McNeil home begin to multiply. Reagan reveals that she has been playing with a Ouija board and claims to be able to communicate with a spiritual entity entirely on her own. A nearby Catholic church has been desecrated, with a crudely painted statue of the Virgin Mary adorned with conical clay additions resembling breasts and a penis. Reagan also creates small animal sculptures out of clay and paint. Meanwhile, Father Karras's mother becomes ill, and due to a lack of funds, she is admitted to a rundown hospital and assigned to a ward full of mentally ill patients. When Father Karras visits her, she appears to blame him for her situation. Later, she dies under these circumstances, adding to his grief. Chris throws a lavish party at her home for a number of wealthy guests. One of her guests is another Jesuit named Father Dyer, Reverend William O'Malley, and Chris asks him about Karras, having noticed him and referring to him as intense. Karras and Dyer are good friends, she discovers. Reagan appears to be happy and social during the party, but she reappears after being sent to bed, dressed in her nightgown, and urinates on the carpet in front of the guests while making an ominous statement to a prominent astronaut, "You're going to die up there." Chris bathes Reagan and puts her to bed after the guests leave, but is startled by a loud sound from Reagan's bedroom. She rushes back down the hall and finds Reagan's bed violently shaking and rising up off the floor with Reagan on it. Chris jumps on the bed, and it continues to levitate. Chris puts Reagan through a battery of medical tests to figure out what's wrong. Despite putting Reagan through some grueling, painful procedures, the doctors are unable to find anything. The best they can come up with is that Reagan may have a brain lesion, but when nothing appears on her brain scan, they are frustrated. Reagan appears to be having a seizure at Chris's house, and 2 doctors arrive to help. They discover her rising and falling up and down on the bed in an unnatural manner for a human being. When they try to sedate her, she hurls them across the room with unusual force, speaking to them in a male voice, "Keep your distance. I have the sow." They eventually sedate her. Out of options, they advise Chris to seek the services of a psychiatrist, but they also discuss another possibility: demonic possession and the rite of exorcism. While they appear to have professional contempt for it, they do admit that it has been used to solve problems such as Reagan's. Chris is skeptical, as she has no religious affiliation. When Chris goes out one evening, she returns to find the house deserted except for Reagan, who is alone in her bedroom and appears to be sleeping. The bedroom is freezing cold, the window is open, and she is naked. Chris is furious when Sharon returns, accusing her of abandoning Reagan, but Sharon explains that she left Reagan in the care of Burke, who was visiting the house, while she went to the pharmacy to get Reagan's medication. Burke's absence goes unnoticed until the doorbell rings and a Chris associate informs him that Burke has died on the steps outside Chris's house. Soon after, Chris is visited by a kind detective named Kinderman, Lee J. Cobb, who appears to be investigating Burke's death. He interrogates Chris about what happened that night, and Chris is nervous, hesitant to tell him about Reagan's problem. During his visit, he notices a few small animal figures made by Reagan, which are similar in style to the desecration of the statue in the church. Kinderman departs, and a violent disturbance emanates from Reagan's bedroom. Chris hears a deep male voice commanding Reagan to do it, and Reagan screams in defiance. Chris walks into the bedroom to find Reagan violently inserting a crucifix into her vagina. When Chris tries to stop her, Reagan attacks her with unfathomable strength, and the furniture in the room begins to move on its own. As Chris looks on in horror, her daughter's head completely turns around backwards and she speaks to Chris in Burke's voice, saying to her, "Do you have any idea what she did? Your scheming daughter." Chris then realizes Reagan is to blame for Burke's death. Chris arranges a meeting with Father Karras out of desperation, and when she mentions exorcism, Karras is almost amused. He informs her that exorcism is almost unheard of and that he is unaware of anyone who has ever performed one. Chris is upset and persuades him to meet with Reagan anyway. The girl's appearance astounds Karras. She is tied to the headboard of her bed, her face misshapen and covered in lesions, her voice deep and gravelly. Reagan declares herself to be the devil and plays with Karras in a variety of ways, including appearing to make a drawer next to the bed open on its own and speaking to Karras in a variety of languages. She also summons the voice of a subway vagrant whom Karras has previously encountered alone. Karras is still skeptical, and when Reagan says, "Your mother's in here with us," he asks what his mother's maiden name is. Reagan, unable to respond, vomits spectacularly all over him. Chris cleans Kara's sweater and talks to him about Reagan. Kara's is still not convinced that Reagan is possessed, especially since she claims to be the devil, and he advises her to seek psychiatric help. Chris begs him for assistance in obtaining an exorcism, swearing that the thing in the bed upstairs is not her daughter. While Kara's mulls it over, he is approached by Kinderman, who questions him about the possibility that the church desecration was linked to Burke's death. What he was unable to tell Chris was that Burke's body was discovered with his head completely turned around backwards, and the police department considers it a homicide. Kinderman is aware that Kara's has suspicions about the McNeil residence, but his confidentiality as a priest prevents him from discussing it with Kinderman. Kara's returns to Reagan and records their conversation, during which he sprinkles water on her. When he tells her it's holy water, she starts writhing in pain, appearing to go into a trance and speaking in a strange language. Later, he tells Chris that proving possession to the bishop will be difficult. The water he sprinkled on Reagan was simply tap water, not blessed. Einsteiner applauded with. Chris confides in Kara's, revealing that Reagan was the one who murdered Burke Dennings. Kara's later uses his tape recordings of Reagan's seemingly incomprehensible babble to discover that she is actually speaking English backwards. Sharon interrupts him with a phone call. She summons him to the house to see Reagan, not wanting Chris to see what's going on. As they look at Reagan's unconscious body, the words, "Help me," begin to materialize on her stomach, rising up in her skin like scar tissue. Kara's reluctantly agrees to help Reagan obtain an exorcism, despite the fact that he appears to have more in common with the doctors who recommended it as a form of shock therapy. Father Marin is summoned by the church to perform the exorcism, with Kara's assisting. Marin has previously performed exorcisms, including one that nearly killed him, according to the bishop. When Marin arrives at the McNeil residence, Reagan yells his name from upstairs, as if she recognizes him, and she makes strange animal noises. He cautions Kara's against conversing with the demon, reminding him that the demon will mix lies with the truth in order to confuse and attack them. When they walk into Reagan's room, she immediately starts yelling obscenities. Marin and Kara's perform the exorcism ritual, while Reagan exhibits strange phenomena such as levitation, telekinesis, an abnormally long tongue, and strange vomiting. She constantly curses the priests and laughs evilly and verbally abuses them. Reagan begins to cry as he speaks to Kara's in the voice of his mother. Marin dismisses him. When he returns, Marin is dead on the floor, the victim of a heart attack. Kara's is enraged when Reagan cackles gleefully, so he grabs her and yells at the demon, "Come on in. Please take me." Kara's begins to transform almost immediately, while Reagan returns to her normal self. Before he can harm her, Kara's normal personality emerges for a split second and he commits suicide by throwing himself out Reagan's window. He falls down the stairs outside Reagan's window, just like Burke, and dies in the street below. By chance, Father Dyer arrives on the scene and performs the last rites for his friend. In a brief epilogue, we see Chris and Reagan getting ready to leave their Georgetown home. Father Dyer pays them a visit. Chris speaks with him privately and informs him that Reagan has no recollection of the possession or the exorcism. Reagan then appears and cheerfully greets him, his gaze drawn to Father Dyer's white collar. Before they leave, she unexpectedly hugs and kisses Father Dyer. As Chris drives away, she orders the driver to stop for a moment and hands Father Dyer the religious medallion that had belonged to Father Karras. During their struggle, Reagan had torn it from his body, and it had been in her bedroom the entire time. Please subscribe my channel. Thanks for watching.